Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Rowe.
And I'm Nike Fajors.
And welcome to The Invisible Men, where we make the achievements of incredible men invisible no more. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
I'm Nike Fajors, a member of the Leadership Network at AEI.
Yeah, Nike, it's good to see you. And as our viewers know, each week we feature some pretty exceptional men who you may not know, but who are doing just incredible work in their community or in business or in pop culture or in journalism. And today we are quite honored to have someone who may not be so invisible, but still whose ideas are pretty powerful. And we're honored to have the opportunity to welcome Jason Riley. Hello, Jason. How are you?
I'm good, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Jason, you are a columnist at the Wall Street Journal, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. You've written several books. You wrote False Black Power, and you wrote a book which I think is like one of the greatest titles of all time, Please Stop Helping Us, which I thought was just a great title. And you have just written probably a book of in some ways, the prototypical invisible man, Thomas Sowell. It's called Maverick. So we can't wait to dive into what led you to write this book, how you got access to Thomas Sowell, and why his work is so important. But before we get there, we'd love to know just a little bit about you, the Jason Riley before the Wall Street Journal, before the Manhattan Institute, before all of these great books. When you were younger and you were kind of making your way in the world, what experience led you to think differently, or to lead you to the way that you view the world today?
Well, Ian, I wasn't a particularly politically astute kid. I was into sports and movies and things like that, and I was not particularly aware politically of what was going around. I was a child of the 80s. Reagan was president for most of my childhood, and it's just not something I thought about a lot. I was from a very religious family. My parents were divorced, and my mother took us to church 3 times a week. So I guess there was a sort of cultural conservatism built into that through the sort of black church. But I didn't think a lot about politics. We didn't sit around the dinner table discussing politics. And
where was this?
I'm sorry?
Where was this?
I grew up in Buffalo, New York, upstate New York, where I also went to school. So it wasn't really until college that I began to think about these things in any depth. And it just so happens that one of the first people I encountered that gave me a very interesting perspective on these things was Thomas Sowell, who I discovered in college. I was working on the school paper and talking about affirmative action with a group of fellow students, and someone said, "Jason, you sound like Tom Sowell." And I said, "Who's that?" and the person wrote down the name of a book on a sheet of paper, and I went to the school library that evening and checked it out and read it in one sitting, and went back the next day and checked out the rest of the Thomas Sowell collection. And I've been hooked ever since. He's had a tremendous influence on the way I think about things, my interest in economics in particular. And so he is, I wanted to write the book for personal reasons because of that, in addition to sort of showcasing him to a broader audience.
Wow, interesting. So does he know that? Was that how you hooked him in, to tell him to?
No. I what happened was I joined the Wall Street Journal pretty much right out of college, and was working on the editorial page in New York. And Sowell would come through New York on book tours, and this would be in the mid-1990s. And so I initially met him when he came through New York City to meet with various editorial boards. I was at the Journal at the time. That's when I first met him in person. I then later went out to Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where he's based, to do a profile of him for the paper. And that would have been in the mid-2000s. And that's when we sort of struck up an acquaintance that has endured. And shortly after that profile ran, I began kind of dogging him about being his biographer. He didn't have one. I'm his only biographer. This is the first biography ever written of him. He's written a memoir, but no one's ever written a biography of him. And he was a little reluctant. And I think, he's going to be 91 years old in June. So maybe I just wore him down. He finally wanted me to stop bothering him about it and agreed to cooperate. He told me to go ahead and write it. He didn't need to cooperate, but I didn't want to write it without his cooperation. So
Sure.
I wanted him to give me the go ahead.
Yeah, it's also just a better book because he can give you those insights. So what is it? Why is it that someone like Thomas Sowell, it's very interesting, Nike, we've had several guests who said that Thomas Sowell, discovering Thomas Sowell's works were so influential in their own lives.
Absolutely.
So Jason, what do you think it is that someone like a Thomas Sowell who is so prolific, so extraordinarily detailed in his research, that oftentimes bucked the dominant narrative, particularly around race-related issues, why isn't his work more celebrated and known, especially as we have conversations about race and racism and what the factors are that are driving outcomes, particularly for the Black community?
Well, I think the short answer to your question, Ian, is that Tom Sowell was sort of canceled before it was cool. He was someone that the political left went after a long, long time ago, back in the 1970s, when he began to write about racial controversies, and they succeeded by and large. The media succeeded in isolating him, and other intellectuals succeeded in isolating him largely. And it's one of the reasons why he is not as well known today as someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram Kendi or Nicole Hannah-Jones or Cornel West or Henry Louis Gates and folks like that who are sort of mentioned in this Black pantheon of intellectuals in America. And I think that's a shame. I think Sowell has written circles around those guys, not just in terms of how wide-ranging his research has been in various areas, but also the depth and the rigor of his thinking, I think, is unmatched. They don't come close to Sowell on these issues. But as you know, it is the political left that controls, not only academia and the foundation world, but also controls the circles and who gives out prizes and awards to intellectuals and so forth. And Sowell has simply, refused to play footsie with these folks over the years. And I think it's cost him professionally, particularly in terms of recognition. And the reason he's gotten into trouble with them, I think, is of a piece with the reason and how he's distinguished himself as a scholar. That is to say, Thomas Sowell is a straight shooter. He is a tell it like it is kind of guy. He's someone who follows the facts where they lead. He is not concerned if those conclusions are politically incorrect or unfashionable or unpopular. He thinks the role of a scholar and an intellectual is to tell the truth. And that is what he does. And it is largely, is often an unvarnished truth, and he is not willing to sugarcoat things. And when it comes to certain racial controversies, as you know, the pressure is to sugarcoat, or if a finding is politically incorrect, to keep it to yourself. That may make you unpopular, cost you professionally. And again, Sowell has been someone who has not concerned himself with those things, and I think it's made him more controversial.
Well, I have to make two comments, Jason. One, I'm so happy that he's alive as you complete this book and it's published this month. I think that's important. That matters because the respect. I don't. Does he know how many people out there really treasure him?
I think I think he has some idea. He's got he's not on social media at all, never has been, but he has a fan account on Twitter.
I've
has
seen
more than 700,000 followers. His
one of them.
videos on YouTube have millions and millions of views. And I, in addition to writing the book, I narrated this documentary film about Sowell, and it was available on YouTube and Amazon and some other places. And we were able to look at the demographics of who was streaming it. And I was very happy to find out that it was a lot of younger people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. So that made me feel very good. That is the audience I'd like to reach. I think Sowell is his work is extremely important. We're still talking about many of these issues that he delved into decades ago. He was right then. He's still right. Everything from the social justice debates, this critical race theory stuff, the affirmative action debates, the slavery reparations debates. Sowell has tackled all of that and been right about all of that. And I think his research is still very, very relevant to what's going on today.
And I don't want to give too much away about the book, but where does the book end? Where do you sort of end your?
Well, the book is mostly an intellectual biography. It focuses on his ideas as a scholar, where he's distinguished himself. He started out and never really stopped writing about economic history. That's what his PhD was in, the history of economic thought and ideas. And he studied under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago. And so his first books were about economic history. Sowell is a student of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and David Ricardo and those guys. And that was his first love. And that's what he sort of stuck to writing about for most of the 60s. It wasn't until the 1970s that he really turned to writing about racial issues. And it was because he saw the civil rights movement going down a path that he thought was ill-advised. A movement that had been focused on equal opportunity was shifting in its focus on equal outcomes and special treatment for blacks and so forth. And Sowell said this is not the way to go. It also became much more focused, the civil rights movement did, particularly after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, on seeking political clout for blacks, putting more blacks in office, and thinking that would be the key to closing other racial gaps, economically, educationally, and so forth, if we can just get more of our own in office. And Sowell saw, again, through his work on economic history and the history of ideas, that this was not the way to go. So he began to weigh in on this stuff in the 1970s, and it rubbed a lot of the civil rights movement types the wrong way, as well as the intellectuals who believed in that strategy the wrong way. And so these controversies go back some time, and Sowell was there at the beginning.
What would you say is the single most significant data point or narrative that Sowell has debunked as it relates to race? Because you say he's
yeah. There are several. One big picture point that he has made is, and he gets into this in what he considers his most important book, or his favorite book, which is A Conflict of Visions, a book that he wrote about political philosophy and the roots of our differences and controversies and political thinking over the centuries. He traces the roots of these conflicts, and what he describes in there is the view that some people have that assume that in the natural order of things, human capital would be equally distributed throughout different groups. And we would therefore see something approaching or approximating proportionate outcomes in, say, income or educational attainment or employment and so forth. And so people start as if that is the natural state of things. And then they set out to find what is thwarting this natural condition. And of course, the problem is that people who have actually studied societies down through history, both here in the US and around the world, find nothing approaching proportionate outcomes or the proportionate distribution of human capital, skills, habits, behaviors, attitudes among different groups. This is nowhere to be found. So something that is held up as the norm that is found nowhere. And something that is found everywhere, meaning disproportionate outcomes, is held out as something aberrant that we must tackle and solve. And Sowell has questioned the premise of this thinking. throughout his scholarship. And I think that is an insight, I think, that will endure and really permeates a lot of his work, particularly on race and culture. This idea that equal outcomes are the norm, and where we don't find them, something is wrong, something nefarious is going on.
Well, what's interesting about that is, right, there's no such, there are disproportionate outcomes because you don't get equal outcomes by immutable characteristics, right? So simply because someone is Black or a woman, that shouldn't guarantee outcomes. But there are outcomes that his research does support, right? That is related to certain behaviors or attitudes. Doesn't his work also, because I think this is important to highlight, that you can more likely predict outcomes with different kinds of inputs.
Well, what he has focused on is the importance of culture and the importance of human capital, the development of human capital. And again, by human capital, I'm talking about the development of certain skills and attitudes and behaviors that help a group succeed economically in society. And his work has shown that if a group has that human capital going for it, it can overcome all kinds of other obstacles that society might throw at them. In other words, hated groups, discriminated groups that have been discriminated against, from the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia to Jews in Eastern Europe to the Japanese here in the United States and Canada. These hated groups have nevertheless developed human capital that has allowed them to not only rise economically to the level of the majority group, but to surpass, in many cases, those majority groups, despite the discrimination that they faced in the past or may currently still face. And so the importance of developing that human capital has been something that Sowell's work has focused on. Whereas the other side comes at this by seeing discrimination as the main obstacle, or racism as the main obstacle to an ethnic or racial minority group's progress, and therefore focusing on eliminating that racism or discrimination as the only way to help that minority group advance. And Sowell said, given human nature, the likelihood that we are going to eliminate discrimination and racism and bias and prejudice is a little far-fetched. So focusing on that, focusing on the moral failings of other people may give you emotional release. It may make you feel better, but the question is, will it help that minority group advance? And he says no. The development of that human capital is what will do it. And what he points to, in addition to these other racial and ethnic groups around the world, is what was happening in Black America after the Civil War. Through Reconstruction and through the Jim Crow era, when the focus was on the development of that human capital and the outcomes we saw among Blacks in terms of educational attainment, in terms of growing incomes, in terms of entering skilled professions, all of these trends were moving in the right direction. Racial inequality was narrowing during this period. And then what you see happen is the 1960s welfare state interventions come into being, and the disintegration of the Black family. And a lot of those previous trends either slowed, stalled, or in some cases completely reversed course. And what you see today, therefore, is not what the left says is legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, so much as a legacy of the Great Society interventions that were, of course, intended to help, but put in place perverse incentives that have led to outcomes that we did not anticipate.
Jason, before we move to our speed round, I want to turn the lens back to you for just a moment and ask about the Wall Street Journal. That's obviously been a big part of your career. It's a I would define, a truly great American institution that has contributed mightily to the advancement of a lot of the values that the three of us embrace. What's that experience been like? What kind of a place is it being there?
Well, it was a wonderful place to work. I mean, as I said earlier, I joined pretty much 6 months after after graduating from college. So it's really the only place I'd ever worked, and it was a great place to work. It was a great experience if you're curious about the world and like to travel and things like that. It was a wonderful career. After I wrote the book "Please Stop Helping Us," some people came to me and said, "Would you like to join a think tank and focus on writing these on these racial and cultural issues?" And I had hesitated to do that because when I was on the staff of the Wall Street Journal, you sort of use the sports analogy. You're hitting to all fields. You're writing about taxes and politics and this and that, and you don't really just focus on one area in particular. And I thought, I like that. I like the variety. But I look at people like Sowell or people like Shelby Steele. We just lost Walter Williams, another big intellectual hero of mine. They were getting up there, and I did not see a younger generation, particularly of Black thinkers, coming along to take their place. And I contrasted that with what I see on the left, where when Cornel West and Skip Gates are out of the picture, I see a whole army of Ibram Kendis and Ta-Nehisi Coates is coming along to fill their shoes, and I find that very disturbing because I profoundly disagree with the direction of the conversation they wanna have. And I said, I'm not Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams or Shelby Steele or Glenn Lowry. I'm not a scholar, an intellectual. In the sense that I'm a journalist, but I can do what I can do as a journalist to keep their ideas out there in circulation, talk about them on television or on podcasts, and write about them more often. And so when someone came to me after I wrote that book and said, do you want to join the think tank world and focus on these things? I decided to do that. And so I left the Journal. I'm no longer on staff there. I just write the column. So that's all I do now. And the column is great. It helps me get these ideas out there. And so I'm enjoying it. I really am.
Brilliant. Thank you for that background. Ian, were you going to say something?
Well, I'm curious, since you bring up the Wall Street Journal, how has the Journal managed to not have a woke ideology infiltrate in the way it seems to have infiltrated almost every other major news organization? Well,
there might be some aspect of tradition at the Journal that is held up. The Journal has always had something of a Chinese wall between the editorial pages and the news side, and that's held ground so far. There was, in other words, there would never be any expectation that the Wall Street Journal editorial page would change its tune to accommodate what the news side was doing. Whereas in other papers, I don't think there is the same sort of red line exists that exists at the Journal. So that I think has probably helped matters. And I think management is wise to do that. I think that the Journal editorial page brings in a lot of readers. There are a lot of people who buy the paper for the editorial page. And if you were just going to turn the editorial page into an extension of the news side, which is what is the case at a lot of other major papers, I think you lose something that that right now is value added in terms of the product that you're that you're putting out. But things are changing in journalism, and it's the business model is changing. There was a time when I started out in the mid '90s where you had large corporations, your IBMs or your Cisco or somebody would buy these $100,000 full page ads in the Wall Street Journal, and that was the business model. It was to lure in those big ads, and that's what paid for the paper. We weren't making money off of newsstand sales. Yeah, right. The number of subscriptions didn't really matter. What mattered was the advertising dollars. That whole model has been completely flipped on its head now. after the tech bust in 2000, those ads, those $100,000 ads went away and they never came back. And the model is now shifted to subscribers. And that is where the money is made now, from subscriptions. And what that means and how that has impacted the content is that when your money is coming from advertisers who want to reach a broad audience, that is reflected in the coverage of the newspaper. When you're relying on readers and versus relying on readers and trying to give those readers what they want and then some, could mean you're putting out a very, very different product. And this isn't just something that the Wall Street Journal has dealt with. This is, I think, what you're seeing going on in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post. They have gotten a lot more partisan, particularly, during the Trump years, more ideological. That is partly a result of them needing to respond to the demands of their readers in a way they did not have to in the past, because those readers were not the source of revenue for the bottom line in those companies. But now it is. And so I think you see news organizations grappling with that, particularly print journalism.
We'll have to have another podcast just on how do we rectify that, because that's a chilling state of affairs, because it's not clear how that model is going to undo itself.
Yeah, very true.
It's not.
So, Jason, we'll transition to what we call the speed round, where I'll offer up two individuals or two philosophies and ask you to pick one and tell us why you pick that particular instance or person. So we'll start with Malcolm or Martin.
In hindsight, Martin, and because it worked. Martin Luther King's methods led to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, hugely consequential pieces of legislation. And, today his methods are dismissed as respectability politics, and they're sort of degraded by some younger whippersnappers out there in the activist crowd. But the fact of the matter is, they were effective. This idea that you care about how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you behave, not because it means that it'll eliminate racism, but because those features are conducive to advancing economically in a free market society like we have. So I think it's hands down that King's approach was the right approach, and I think that approach still has a lot to teach us about how to move forward today.
And continuing on, so civil rights or economic development?
I think the civil rights battles have been fought and won by the right side, I might add. And I think the problem we have today is that a lot of the problems that blacks face are being put under the civil rights rubric, where they don't belong, and that is impacting how we go about addressing them. So, the South Side of Chicago is getting shot up every weekend. That's a problem. It's not a civil rights problem. The Klan is not driving through the South Side of Chicago shooting it up. And so, we have an achievement gap in this country. It is not because black kids are relegated to schools that don't have resources, or that don't have books, like you were talking about in the Jim Crow South 70, 80 years ago. Yet this is, again, is being discussed in that context. And so I think, blacks are not being denied access to the ballot, even though, again, we're talking about voter suppression as if this is counting jelly beans in a jar and poll taxes when that is not what is going on here. Blacks in 2008 and 2012 turned out at higher rates than whites to vote. Blacks in a state like Georgia are registered at higher rates than whites are. So again, when we're talking about a lot of these issues as if it's still 1960, and I think that is one of the problems that we're still having. I do think the focus needs to be on economic development, and because I think that those civil rights battles have been won.
And lastly, I couldn't leave this alone. Carter G. Woodson or Thomas Sowell?
I'm a Sowell guy, obviously, but without a Carter G. Woodson, there probably is no Thomas Sowell. So Sowell is, particularly in his early writings, drew a lot of inspiration from people like Carter G. Woodson, and so I think he'd agree with that. There were, Sowell had a tough upbringing, but he knows that a previous generation went through even more hell than he did, and he's never lost sight of that.
Very good. Thanks, Jason.
All right. Well, Jason, we know you need to roll. And earlier you said that Thomas Sowell has this account. Like, he's not on social media, but he's got 700,000 followers, of which I am one. And you said that you looked at the demographics and you were pleased to find that there was a large population of young people. So that's very promising. And so, I want to come to our question about Daryl, our 16-year-old imaginary black kid who lives in forgotten USA. Because the likelihood is that Daryl is not one of those young people who's actually heard of Thomas Sowell or Carter G. Woodson or Jason Riley. It's unlikely. Maybe he'll have the experience you did. So I'm curious, maybe from two vantage points, because this was the whole impetus for NICU and I to start this many years ago, providing advice to Daryl because we were invisible to him. Men like us were invisible. That was our assumption. What do you think Thomas Sowell would say to a Daryl in terms of finding his pathway in the world, knowing that these ideas that he's probably not getting exposed to? So what do you think Thomas Sowell would provide in terms of advice? And then what would you provide in terms of what you'd say to Daryl?
Well, I think we would both say to a young person like that they need to educate themselves, and if they do that, they will realize that whatever problems are out there today, and I'm not someone who thinks there are no racists out there, that racism has been vanquished from America, or that I will live to see the day when it has been. At the same time, it's clear from someone who does their homework and puts up a history book that there have never been more or better opportunities for blacks in this country and therefore in the world than exist today. And that his job is to prepare himself to take advantage of those opportunities. And that should be what his focus is on, not on playing the victim and not on making excuses as to why he can't succeed, but to keep in mind what others went through before him, what they were able to overcome, and why he has even fewer hurdles to overcome. And he should be appreciative of that and not let those opportunities go to waste.
Yeah. One final follow-up, because I can hear people who, hear an answer like that and say, you see, he's just saying Daryl's got to lift himself up by the bootstraps. What do you say when you hear that kind of comeback to...
I say again that these are people who don't seem to know their history, and don't know, I referenced it earlier, what was going on in Black America prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prior to the affirmative action programs of the 1970s, prior to the Great Society welfare state expansions. blacks were lifting themselves up. Between 1940 and 1960, the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points before affirmative action, before any major civil rights legislation passed. These people simply don't know that history, and I would encourage them to educate themselves about what was going on. Gaps were closing at this time. They were narrowing significantly at this time. During a period, yes, whites were making gains too, but not as fast as blacks were making gains at this period. The rate at which blacks were entering the skilled professions between 1940 and 1970 quadrupled before affirmative action. And so people who want to ascribe all of this progress that blacks have made to government intervention simply don't know what was going on when the government did not give a damn what was happening to black people in this country and what blacks therefore had to do for themselves. It's a rich history that we should be celebrating, but unfortunately, too few people know about it.
Wow. Well, Jason Riley, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing your work and the work of Thomas Sowell into much greater visibility. Our whole goal is to make these kind of achievements invisible no more. Well,
thank you for having me.
Yes, I thank our viewership for listening to another episode of The Invisible Men. If you'd like to watch other episodes, please go to www.invisible.men. Nike, as always, great to see you.
Great to see you as well. Brother Riley, just please tell us and our viewers and listeners where they can pick up and what day they can pick up Maverick.
Maverick can be pre-ordered on Amazon right now, and it will officially be available on May 25th.
Wonderful. I'm getting in line right after this.
They can watch the Sowell documentary, Common Sense in a Senseless World, on YouTube, on Vimeo, on Amazon Prime, or it may still be showing on their local public television station.
Oh, wow.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you, Jason.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Thank you for watching another episode of The Invisible Men. You can find other episodes at the AEI podcast channel on YouTube or the website invisible.men or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.